The note was so small it almost disappeared beneath the rim of the breakfast plate. Charlotte Sawyer saw it the moment she lifted the blue-speckled tin to set it down on the kitchen table, her traveling bag already packed and leaning against the front door like a quiet accusation. She had been moving through the Boone household in the gray, pre-dawn hours, careful not to wake anyone, telling herself it was kinder this way. Telling herself that a clean break was better than a drawn-out goodbye that would only make a difficult situation worse. She had made her decision. She had written the letter to her sister in Abilene. She had folded her two good dresses and placed her mother's Bible on top of them in the bag, and she had told herself firmly that she was not the kind of woman who cried over things she could not change. Then she picked up the plate. The note was folded twice into a small, uneven square, the edges creased with the careful, deliberate pressure of small fingers. Charlotte's own fingers trembled as she opened it. The handwriting was large and labored, each letter formed with the concentration of a child who had only recently mastered the alphabet, the pencil strokes heavy in some places and feather-light in others, as if the writer had been holding their breath. "Please do not leave us." 4 words. No signature, though she did not need one. She knew immediately that it had been Rosie, Grant Boone's youngest, who was 6 years old and had taken to following Charlotte around the house like a small, solemn shadow since Charlotte had first arrived 3 months ago. Rosie, who had lost her mother 18 months before Charlotte ever set foot in Hatcher Creek, Texas. Rosie, who still sometimes woke in the night calling out a name Charlotte was not. Charlotte stood in the kitchen with the note in her hand, and felt something inside her chest break open in a way that all of her careful, logical thinking could not hold shut. She pressed one hand flat against the kitchen table to keep herself upright. Outside, the sky was beginning to go from black to the deep bruised purple that came just before dawn on the Texas plains, and the cattle in the far pasture were beginning to stir, and somewhere down the hall, behind the closed door of the room she had never been invited into, Grant Boone was sleeping, or pretending to sleep, or lying awake staring at the ceiling the way he did on the nights when the weight of everything he carried became too heavy to set down. And Charlotte Sawyer, who had come to Hatcher Creek as a practical arrangement and nothing more, stood in his kitchen in her traveling clothes and wept silently over a note written by his 6-year-old daughter, and understood, with a clarity that felt like sunlight breaking through storm clouds, that she was not going anywhere. Not yet. Not until she understood exactly how she had ended up here, and whether there was any version of this story that could end differently than she had already decided it must. She set the note down very gently beside her plate. Then she sat down in the wooden chair that had become, over 3 months, quietly and without ceremony, her chair. And she waited for the house to wake up. 3 months earlier, Charlotte Sawyer had stepped off the westbound stage in Hatcher Creek, Texas, on a Thursday afternoon in April of 1882, and the first thing she noticed was that the town was smaller than the advertisement had implied. The second thing she noticed was Grant Boone. He was standing at the edge of the stage depot with his hat in both hands, turning the brim in slow circles the way a man does when he is nervous but too proud to show it plainly. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that was too long for propriety, and a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same limestone that made up the bluffs along the creek the town was named for. He was 34 years old, though Charlotte would not learn that for another week. He looked like a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time, and had gotten so used to the weight that he no longer remembered what it felt like to put it down. Charlotte was 26. She had grown up in St. Louis, the daughter of a schoolteacher and a woman who had died of influenza when Charlotte was 9, and she had spent the better part of her adult life teaching in a small schoolhouse on the eastern edge of the city, until the school had closed for lack of funds, and her modest savings had begun to run out, and her landlady had raised the rent, and her older sister Helen had written from Abilene to say that there were opportunities in the West for women of education and good sense. The advertisement she had answered had been placed in the Kansas City paper by one Grant Boone of Hatcher Creek, Texas, who was seeking a housekeeper and tutor for his 3 children, aged 12, 9, and 6, following the death of his wife. The advertisement had been careful and precise in a way that suggested the man who wrote it was careful and precise, and it had specified that the position was one of employment, not matrimony, and that the successful applicant could expect fair wages, a private room, and a household of orderly habits. Charlotte had answered it because she needed employment, and because St. Louis had begun to feel like a room with the walls closing in, and because something in the careful, precise language of the advertisement had suggested to her that the man behind it was honest, even if he was not warm. She had not expected him to be so thoroughly, devastatingly handsome. She had also not expected to feel the way she felt when he looked up from his hat turning, and his eyes found hers across the dusty stage depot yard, brown eyes that were serious and direct, and held within them a grief so old it had settled into something quiet and permanent, like a scar that had finished healing, but never fully disappeared. He had walked toward her with the careful deliberateness of a man who measured every step. "Miss Sawyer," he had said, and his voice was low and even, a voice accustomed to commanding large spaces without raising itself. "Mr. Boone," she had replied, and they had shaken hands with the formal politeness of two people who understood the nature of the arrangement they had entered into and intended to honor it exactly. The children had been in the wagon. She had met them in order of age. Caleb, 12, who had his father's dark hair and his father's watchful eyes, and regarded her with the suspicious assessment of a boy who had learned to be cautious of change. Then Nate, 9, gap-toothed and freckled and immediately, unguardedly curious, who asked her within the first 5 minutes whether she knew how to shoot a pistol. And finally Rosie, 6, small and dark-eyed and utterly serious, who had studied Charlotte with an intensity that seemed too old for her face, and then without preamble had reached out and taken Charlotte's hand in both of her small ones, as if settling a question she had been considering for some time. Grant Boone had watched this last exchange from the wagon seat, with an expression Charlotte could not read. She would spend the next 3 months trying to read the expressions on Grant Boone's face, and she would make more progress than she ever expected, and less than she needed. The Boone Ranch was 2 miles outside of town, a substantial spread by the standards of West Texas in 1882, with a solid main house built of timber and adobe, a proper barn, 2 bunkhouses for the hands, and a kitchen garden that had gone somewhat to ruin in the 18 months since Ellen Boone had died and left no one to tend it. Grant had told Charlotte about Ellen with the economy of a man who had learned to talk about painful things briefly and then stop. His wife had been dead for a year and a half. She had died of a fever that had come on sudden and gone to her lungs. She had been 30 years old. Her name was not to be spoken in a way that distressed the children. Charlotte had understood from this brief account several things. She had understood that Grant Boone had loved his wife. She had understood that the loss had been catastrophic, the kind that reorganizes a man's entire interior landscape. And she had understood, with the instinct of a woman who had grown up motherless and knew something about the particular gravity of that absence, that the 3 children in this household were still, even now, circling the hole she had left in the shape of everything they did. She had set about her work with the thoroughness that was one of her best qualities. The kitchen garden had been replanted within the first 2 weeks. The schoolroom, which was actually the parlor repurposed 2 mornings a week, had been organized with the materials Charlotte had brought from St. Louis. Caleb had initially refused to attend lessons, declaring himself too old for a schoolroom, until Charlotte had produced a copy of Euclid's Elements and proposed that they begin with geometry, at which point the boy's studied indifference had cracked slightly to reveal what lived underneath it. A hungry, serious intelligence that had not been adequately fed. Nate was cheerful and easily distracted and required a different approach entirely. Charlotte taught him with movement and story and competition, turning arithmetic into games and geography into adventure, and he rewarded her with an enthusiasm that was one of the genuine pleasures of the job. And Rosie had sat beside Charlotte from the first lesson and learned everything with the quiet, focused intensity she brought to all things, and at the end of each morning she would take Charlotte's hand and hold it for a moment before going outside to play, as if Charlotte were something she needed to make sure was still real. Grant Boone said little. He was present at dinner, where he asked the children about their day and listened carefully to their answers, and occasionally his eyes would move to Charlotte at the far end of the table, and she would feel the weight of his attention like a hand on her shoulder, there, and then gone. He paid her wages promptly on the first of each month. He asked her once at the end of the second week whether she was comfortable and whether she had everything she needed, and when she said yes, he had nodded and returned to the papers on his desk, and that had been the entirety of their personal conversation for the following 2 weeks. She told herself she did not mind. She told herself she was an employee and he was her employer, and the arrangement was exactly what it had been advertised to be, and she had no business wanting it to be something else. She told herself this with increasing firmness as the weeks passed, and she began to notice other things about Grant Boone that had nothing to do with the orderly management of a household. She noticed that he rose before dawn every morning, and that the first thing he did was stand on the porch with a cup of coffee and look out at the land with an expression that was not quite grief and not quite peace, but something that lived between the two. She noticed that he was patient with his children in a way that cost him nothing, that the patience came from the same deep, quiet place as everything else about him. She noticed that his hands, large and work-roughened, could handle a newborn calf with extraordinary gentleness, and that he read every evening for at least an hour, and that his library, which occupied an entire wall of the study, contained Dickens and Twain and a well-worn copy of Shakespeare's complete works that had been handled so often the spine had given up entirely. She noticed that when he laughed, which was rare, it transformed his whole face, and that the first time she made him laugh accidentally by telling a story about a runaway goat she had encountered in St. Louis, she felt the achievement of it like a small, unexpected victory. She noticed that she was in serious trouble. The trouble had a name, and the name was Grant Boone, and it sat in her chest like an ember she could not put out no matter how firmly she told herself the practical realities of the situation. She was employed in this man's household. He had not advertised for a wife. He had advertised for a housekeeper and tutor, and that was precisely what she was, and the fact that she lay awake in her narrow bed in the room off the kitchen and thought about the line of his jaw in the firelight was a problem she needed to manage privately and carefully, and without allowing it to affect the professional nature of their arrangement. The problem had been manageable. And then had come the evening in the second month, late May, when a spring storm had rolled in off the plains with the suddenness that the Texas weather was capable of, and all 3 children had come tumbling into the main room as the thunder cracked and the rain hammered the adobe walls, and somehow in the rearranging of the household to accommodate the storm. Charlotte had found herself sitting on the parlor floor with Rosie in her lap and Nate pressed against her side, and Caleb sitting close enough that their shoulders touched, reading aloud from Treasure Island while the storm raged outside, and she had looked up from the page at one point and found Grant Boone standing in the doorway of the parlor, still in his oilskin coat from having been out checking the livestock, watching her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. It was the expression of a man looking at something he had believed he would never have again. It was gone so quickly she was not entirely certain she had seen it. He had said something practical about the storm and disappeared back to the study, and Charlotte had returned to the book and tried to remember where she was on the page. But the image of his face in that doorway had stayed with her, settled in somewhere alongside everything else she was trying not to feel, and had made the task of managing her interior situation considerably more difficult. And then had come the dark past. She learned about it not from Grant directly, but from the town. It was Hatcher Creek's gift to her, information she had not asked for, delivered by the woman at the dry goods store, a broad, sharp-faced woman named Mrs. Galvin, who seemed to regard the provision of information as a civic duty. Charlotte had been in town for supplies at the beginning of June when Mrs. Galvin had leaned across the counter with the particular posture of a woman about to say something significant and said, "You know, of course, about the trouble with the Dalton brothers." Charlotte had not known. She said so. Mrs. Galvin had provided the story with evident satisfaction. 2 years before Ellen Boone's death, Grant had been involved in a land dispute with a family named Dalton, brothers named Roy and Clem, who had claimed water rights to the creek that ran through the eastern edge of Grant's property. The dispute had gone to the county court, and Grant had won, legally and fairly, with documents and deed records that proved the water rights had been his family's for 30 years. Roy Dalton had not accepted the verdict well. There had been words between him and Grant in the street outside the courthouse that had escalated, as such things did in small western towns in those years, to something more physical. Grant had walked away from the altercation without serious injury. Roy Dalton had left town within the month, reportedly headed west. The hidden truth in this story, the part Mrs. Galvin delivered with the most relish, was what had happened after. People in Hatcher Creek believed, though they could not prove it, that Roy Dalton had sent men back to the territory. That the fever that had killed Ellen Boone had not been a natural misfortune but something introduced, something put into the water supply of the ranches well during a period when Roy's men had been seen in the area. It was not the kind of thing that could be proven. It was the kind of thing that sat in a community like a stone in a field, undeniable in its presence even if its origin was disputed. Grant Boone had carried this possibility for 2 years. The possibility that his wife had died not from the indiscriminate cruelty of nature, but from the specific, directed malice of a man Grant had made an enemy of in a legal proceeding about water rights. Charlotte had stood in the dry goods store with a bolt of calico in her hands and felt the weight of this information settle onto her like a physical thing. She had carried it home and said nothing. She had no right to ask him about it. She had no standing to address his private grief. She was the housekeeper and tutor, and it was not her place. But something had shifted in her understanding of this man and his household, and the shift was irreversible. She saw the watchfulness in him differently now, the way his eyes moved to the horizon when he stood on the porch in the mornings, the extra care he took with the children's water and food, the trips into town to check whether there was any news from the Western Territories. She saw the weight he carried differently. She saw him differently, and the difference made everything more complicated and more tender and more impossible. It was the impossibility that had driven her, finally, to the decision she had made last night. She had been at the Boone Ranch for 3 months. She was falling in love with a man who was still in the grip of a grief so profound it had become part of his architecture. A man who had given her no indication whatsoever that he saw her as anything other than a competent employee. A man whose dark past and hidden burdens were not hers to carry, however much she had begun to want to. She was falling in love with his children, particularly with Rosie, who had worked her way so deeply into Charlotte's heart in 3 months that the thought of leaving her caused a physical ache behind Charlotte's sternum. She could not stay and watch herself fall further into a love that had no future. She had made her decision. She had packed her bag. She had planned to leave before anyone woke up, to avoid exactly the kind of scene that would make leaving harder than she could bear. And then she had picked up a breakfast plate and found 4 words written by a 6-year-old child, and everything had changed again. Grant Boone found her sitting at the kitchen table at 5:30 in the morning, when he came in from the pre-dawn check of the stock. He stopped in the doorway of the kitchen and looked at her, and then looked at the traveling bag by the front door, and something moved through his face so quickly she almost missed it, something dark and panicked that he immediately contained behind his usual composure. "Miss Sawyer," he said. His voice was perfectly steady. "Good morning, Mr. Boone," she said. He crossed to the stove and poured himself coffee from the pot she had already started, taking a moment longer than necessary to complete this task, and she understood that he was using the time to decide what he was going to say. He turned and looked at the bag by the door. "You are leaving." It was not a question, but she answered it as if it were. "I had planned to." "Had planned to," he repeated carefully. She looked down at the note, which was still folded open on the table beside her plate. After a moment she turned it so he could read it. He read it. She watched his face while he read it, and the composure he carried like armor did not crack exactly, but something around his eyes changed. Something became painful and exposed in a way he could not control. "Rosie," he said quietly. "Yes." He set his coffee cup down on the counter and was quiet for a moment. The house was silent around them, the children still sleeping, the ranch hands not yet stirring in the bunkhouses. Outside, the Texas sky was shifting from deep purple toward the thin gray gold of early morning. "She must have been watching you pack," he said. His voice was low. "I thought I was quiet. Rosie wakes easily. She has since her mother died." He paused. She was afraid for a long time that people would disappear in the night, that she would wake up and someone else she loved would be gone. The words landed in Charlotte's chest like stones dropped into still water, sending circles outward in every direction. "Mr. Boone," she began. "Why?" he said. He was looking at her with those serious, direct eyes, and the question was simple and direct and completely without artifice. "I have paid you fairly. I have asked nothing improper of you. The children are well. What have I done to drive you away?" "You have done nothing," she said. "The fault is entirely mine." He stared at her. "Explain that." She had not expected him to push. She had expected the carefully maintained distance to reassert itself, to allow her an exit that preserved the dignity of the arrangement. She had not expected him to stand in his own kitchen at 5:30 in the morning and demand an explanation with the directness of a man who had decided that politeness was no longer adequate to the situation. She chose honesty because she was, at bottom, an honest woman. "I have become too fond of this household," she said. "Of the children. It is not professional. It is not what you hired me for. And it is not," she paused and made herself finish the sentence, "only the children." The silence that followed was the longest of her life. Grant Boone stood at the kitchen counter with his coffee cup forgotten beside him and looked at her with an expression she could not categorize, that had too many things in it for any one name. Then he said slowly, as if each word cost him something, "I see. I will collect my wages for the month and be gone before the children wake," she said, because she had to say something. "No," he said. She blinked. "Mr. Boone, no," he said again, and there was something in his voice now, underneath the steadiness, something that sounded like a man who had been standing very still for a very long time and had just decided to stop. "You will not leave before the children wake. You will not leave today, and you will not leave at all before you and I have spoken properly, which we have not done in 3 months, and the fault for that is entirely mine, not yours." She stared at him. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, and he set his hands flat on the table between them, and he looked at her with the full weight of his attention in a way that made her feel slightly dizzy. "I placed an advertisement for a housekeeper," he said. "I wrote it very carefully to avoid any implication that I was seeking anything more than that, because I was not ready to seek anything more than that, and because I was afraid of frightening away capable candidates with the suggestion of domestic complications, and because I did not believe at the time that anything more was a possibility I was entitled to want." Charlotte was very still. "I was wrong," he said, "about several of those things." He looked down at his hands and then back up at her. "Ellen has been gone for nearly 2 years. I have not spoken of her to the children as much as I should have, because speaking of her was like reopening something I needed to stay closed in order to function. That was wrong of me, and I have been aware that it was wrong, and I have not known how to correct it." "Mr. Boone, Grant," he said. "My name is Grant. We have been living in the same house for 3 months, and I think you might manage to call me by my name." Something warm and complicated moved through her. "Grant," she said, and the name felt different in her mouth than Mr. Boone had, more solid and specific and real. "She would have liked you," he said. The statement was quiet and almost surprised, as if it had arrived from somewhere he had not been looking. Ellen. She was practical and she was direct, and she had no patience for pretension. She was everything to this family, and when she died, I did not know how to make us work anymore. I hired a series of women from town, each of whom lasted approximately 2 weeks before the children drove them to resignation, or I made them uncomfortable with my complete failure to communicate like a reasonable human being. Charlotte, despite herself, felt the corner of her mouth move. "You have lasted 3 months," he said. "Rosie follows you around the house. Nate learns things from you that he has refused to learn from anyone else. Caleb pretends to be indifferent and quotes geometry at the dinner table when he thinks no one is listening." He stopped. He stopped again, and she saw the cost of what he was trying to say, the immense personal difficulty of a man who had built fortifications against vulnerability and was now attempting to dismantle one of them by hand. "You," she said softly. "I have been finding reasons to be in whatever room you are in," he said. "I have been reading in the kitchen when I have a perfectly good study. I have been coming in from the range earlier than I need to. I have been looking for you." He met her eyes with a directness that was almost painful in its honesty. "I thought I was being discreet. I thought I was managing the situation responsibly. What I was actually doing was allowing you to come to the conclusion that you were unwanted in this household, which is not only untrue, but—" He stopped once more, and when he spoke again his voice was quieter. "The opposite of what is true." The kitchen was very still. Outside the window the sky had gone from gray gold to pale gold, and the first birds were beginning to make noise in the cottonwood trees along the creek. "You have a dark past," Charlotte said quietly. "Roy Dalton, Ellen." She held his gaze. "I know what the town believes about how she died. I'm not asking you to confirm or deny it. I'm only telling you that I know, and that it is not something that frightens me about you or away from you. It is something that makes me understand why you are the way you are." Something happened in his face. The armor did not drop exactly, but a door in it opened. "Mrs. Galvin," he said. "Mrs. Galvin," she confirmed. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "There are men looking for Roy Dalton. Marshals. He is wanted for other things in other territories now. The water, what he may have done." He stopped. "I cannot prove it. I may never be able to prove it. I have made my peace with that as best I can, but the uncertainty stays," she said. "It stays," he agreed. "It is a trap I set for myself by not being able to find certainty. I have been carrying it for 2 years, and I do not know how to put it down." "Grant," she said, and his name in her mouth had become something she wanted to keep saying. "You do not have to put it down alone." He looked at her across the table, across the 3 months of careful professional distance, and the small folded note that was still lying between them, and the expression on his face was the same one she had glimpsed in the doorway during the storm. A man confronting something he had believed was gone. "I don't know how to do this," he said. "I should tell you that plainly. I do not know how to do any of this again. I was married at 20 years old, and we grew into each other over 12 years, and I did not have to learn how to—" He gestured between them, slightly helplessly. "You are doing remarkably well so far," she said. And there it was again, that transformation of his face when he almost laughed, the warming of it, the glimpse of the man underneath the grief and the composure and the weight. "Stay," he said. "Not as the housekeeper, not as the tutor. Stay because—" He stopped and reorganized himself and tried again. "Stay because Rosie wrote you a note at 5 in the morning, and she was right to. Stay because I have been looking for you in every room of this house for 3 months, and I would very much like to stop pretending that I am not. Stay because I would like the opportunity to learn how to do this, if you are willing to tolerate my being terrible at it." Charlotte looked at the note on the table. Then she looked at the man across from her, with his large, careful hands and his grief-carved face and the unexpected warmth in his eyes that he had been hiding as if it were something shameful. "I will stay," she said, "on one condition." His eyebrow moved fractionally. "You must allow me to restore the kitchen garden completely," she said. "It is an absolute disgrace, and it has been bothering me since April." For the first time in 3 months, Grant Boone laughed in a way that was full and unguarded, and Charlotte felt the sound of it settle into her chest and make itself at home. Rosie came into the kitchen at 7, barefooted and cautious, and stopped in the doorway when she saw Charlotte still sitting at the table. Her eyes moved from Charlotte to the traveling bag by the door to her father's face, reading the room with the particular acuity of a child who has learned to pay very close attention to adult behavior. Charlotte held out her hand. "Good morning, Rosie." Rosie came across the kitchen in a rush and climbed into Charlotte's lap without ceremony and put both arms around Charlotte's neck, and Charlotte held her tightly and looked over the top of her dark head at Grant Boone, who was watching them with an expression that had stopped trying to be composed and had given up and become something simpler and more honest than that. He crossed the kitchen and picked up the traveling bag and carried it back down the hall and put it in her room. He came back without the bag. He sat back down at the table. He poured a second cup of coffee and set it in front of Charlotte. Nobody said anything about the bag. Nobody needed to. Caleb arrived next, took in the scene with a 12-year-old studious indifference that fooled nobody, and sat down and asked for breakfast. Nate tumbled in 3 minutes later, talking without pause about a dream he had involving a buffalo and a runaway locomotive, and the kitchen filled with the noise and motion of a morning the family had decided, without discussing it, to have together. The days that followed were different in a way that was difficult to articulate but impossible to miss. The careful professional distance did not disappear overnight. Grant Boone was not a man who changed modes easily or quickly, and Charlotte did not push. But the door that had opened in the kitchen that morning remained open, and things began to move through it in both directions. He began to speak to her in the evenings, not about anything significant at first: the stock, the weather, the state of the eastern pasture fence. The small, practical language of a ranch shared between people who were learning to be comfortable with each other's presence. But gradually the conversations extended, deepened, ranged further from the immediately practical. He told her about growing up on this land, about his father and grandfather, who had built the ranch from almost nothing in the years after the war. He told her about the landscape of West Texas in a way that revealed a man who had looked at it long and carefully enough to see what other people missed: the particular quality of the light in October, the way the creek changed character in different seasons, the hawks that returned to the same rock formation every spring. She told him about St. Louis, about her father's schoolhouse and her mother's absence, about the peculiar combination of freedom and precariousness that came from being a woman with education and limited means in 1882. She told him about the series of positions she had held before arriving in Hatcher Creek, each one teaching her something, none of them feeling like the right place. "Does this feel like the right place?" he asked one evening. They were sitting on the porch, the children in bed, the Texas stars sprawling overhead in the particular extravagance the sky performed out here, far from city lights, a display so lavish it almost looked fabricated. She considered the question seriously, the way he had learned she considered all questions. "Yes," she said, "it does." And then, because she had committed to honesty, he looked at her steadily. "More so every day," he said. In July, a marshal came through Hatcher Creek with news. His name was Colton, a lean, weathered man from the federal office in Austin, and he arrived on a Tuesday and found Grant at the ranch and sat with him in the study for an hour. Charlotte kept the children occupied with lessons, but she was aware of the closed study door in the way you are aware of something you are not looking at but cannot stop watching. When Marshal Colton left, Grant found her in the kitchen garden, which had by now become something genuinely impressive. rows of beans and tomatoes and squash running alongside the herbs she had planted from seeds she had sent away for, and he stood at the edge of the garden and looked at her with an expression that was a combination of things she was still learning to read. "They found Roy Dalton," he said, "in Nevada. He was wanted for a land fraud scheme. 3 warrants in 3 territories." He paused. "He is in custody. He will not be coming back." Charlotte straightened from her kneeling and brushed the soil from her hands. She looked at him. "And the other matter?" He was quiet for a moment. "They cannot prove it. What happened to the well? What happened to Ellen? The evidence is too old and too circumstantial." He met her eyes. "But they believe it. Colton told me he believed it, for whatever that is worth." "It is worth something," she said quietly. "Someone of authority saying aloud that what you feared was probably real, that you were not imagining it, that there was something to grieve beyond the ordinary tragedy of it." He stood at the edge of her garden and looked at her with those eyes that were no longer entirely closed to her, and she saw him take a breath and let something go. Not all of it, not everything, but something. "Yes," he said. "I suppose it is." She crossed the garden and stood close to him, and without quite deciding to do so, she reached out and put her hand over his. He looked down at their hands and then up at her face, and he turned his hand so their fingers were laced together, and they stood there in the July heat among her tomato plants, and let the weight of the thing he had been carrying redistribute itself in the way that weight sometimes can when it is held between 2 people instead of 1. The children were the ones who noticed first, which was perhaps inevitable given that children in a household notice everything adults believe they are concealing. Nate announced at breakfast one morning in August that it was obvious to everyone with eyes that his father liked Miss Sawyer, and Caleb threw a biscuit at his brother and said nobody had asked him, and Rosie serenely helped herself to the butter and said nothing, with the expression of a person whose opinion on the subject had been fixed for some time and required no further discussion. Grant had caught Charlotte's eye across the table over this exchange, and she had looked immediately at the ceiling, and he had pressed his lips together very firmly and stared at his coffee, and neither of them had said anything, which Nate correctly interpreted as confirmation of his thesis. It was late August, 3 weeks after the marshal's visit, when Grant kissed her. They had been coming back from town in the wagon, the children having stayed at the ranch with the foreman's wife, who adored them and liked to feed them things Charlotte did not allow during the week. The sun had been going down behind the hills in an explosion of orange and rose that was almost violent in its extravagance, the kind of sunset the Texas sky produced when it wanted to remind you of its capabilities. They had been talking about something ordinary, the price of cattle or the school in town or something entirely unremarkable, and the conversation had paused in a natural way, the way conversations do between people who are comfortable together, and he had turned to look at her in the wagon seat, and she had turned to look at him at the same moment, and the thing that had been building between them for months was suddenly present and articulate and impossible to pretend away. He stopped the wagon. "Charlotte," he said, and her name in his voice was different from how anyone else had ever said it. "Yes," she said. She was not sure what she was saying yes to. She was sure it did not matter. He kissed her. He was careful about it, not tentative but deliberate, the same quality of deliberateness he brought to everything, and his hand came up to cup her face with a gentleness that could have broken something in her if she had been less determined to hold herself together. It was brief, and when he drew back his eyes were very serious and very close, and there was the faint flush of it along his jaw. "I have not done this in a long time," he said. "I am aware," she said, because she wanted to make him smile, and she succeeded. He kissed her again. This one was less brief. When they arrived back at the ranch, later than planned, Nate was sitting on the porch and announced that they were extremely late and that Mrs. Hargrove had given them pie, and he had eaten his piece and Caleb's piece also because Caleb had gone to bed, and it was only fair. Grant told him to go wash his face. Nate looked between his father and Charlotte with enormous interest and went inside without further interrogation, which was unprecedented. The formal boundaries of the household rearranged themselves after that, gradually and properly, in the manner of the time and place. Grant made his intentions known in the way a man of that era made intentions known, directly, clearly, and with sufficient formality to establish that he was speaking of something permanent. He sat across from Charlotte at the kitchen table one Sunday afternoon and told her that he was asking her to be his wife, and that he understood this was a large decision, and that she should take whatever time she needed, and that the asking itself was the most important thing he had said out loud in nearly 2 years. Charlotte, who had needed approximately 3 seconds, waited the appropriate minute before answering, on the theory that responses delivered too quickly might seem insufficiently considered. "Yes," she said. He reached across the table and took her hand. His grip was firm and warm, and she felt the solidness of it all the way up her arm. "I should ask the children," he said, formally. "You absolutely should," she said. The conversation with the children happened that same evening. Caleb, who had been practicing indifference for 4 months, managed it for approximately 30 seconds before his composure broke entirely, and he said, quietly and without looking at anyone, that it was about time. Nate cheered loudly enough to startle the dog sleeping under the porch. Rosie climbed directly into Charlotte's lap and stayed there for the rest of the evening, and Charlotte held her and thought about a small folded note and understood, completely and without reservation, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. They were married in September at the small Methodist church in Hatcher Creek, which was the most presentable building in town, and had a preacher who was efficient and genuine, and kept the ceremony to a proper length without rushing through any part of it. Charlotte wore her best dress, which was blue, and had borrowed a silk ribbon from the foreman's wife for her hair. Grant wore his dark coat and a clean white shirt and stood at the front of the church and watched her walk toward him with an expression so open and unguarded that several women in the pews who had known him for years and had never seen him look that way quietly wiped their eyes. Rosie was her flower girl. She took the responsibility with extreme seriousness, scattering rose petals with such careful precision that several guests later said it was the most deliberately beautiful thing they had ever seen a child do. Caleb and Nate stood with their father and had the scrubbed, combed appearance of boys who had been cleaned up against their better judgment, but were not unhappy about the occasion. The preacher pronounced them husband and wife in the yellow afternoon light coming through the church's 2 windows, and Grant kissed her, and the church clapped, and somewhere in the back Mrs. Galvin, who had started everything by telling Charlotte about Roy Dalton in the dry goods store, blew her nose loudly and unselfconsciously into a handkerchief. The autumn that followed was the happiest of Charlotte's life. This was a thing she recognized as it was happening, which was rare and valuable. Usually happiness of that particular complete and settled kind was something you identified only in retrospect, when it was over and you understood by its absence what it had been. But Charlotte was aware, in the October mornings when she woke in Grant's room, his room now, their room, with the pale early light coming through the curtain she had hung herself, his arm warm and solid across her waist, the ranch sounds beginning outside, that this was the thing people meant when they talked about home. The particular combination of place and person and belonging that made you feel like you had arrived somewhere you did not know you had been traveling toward. She was aware of it in the evenings when they sat on the porch with the children as the stars came out, and in the schoolroom mornings when Caleb worked geometry problems with fierce concentration and Nate inverted history into wild adventure and Rosie read ahead in every book Charlotte assigned, and then pretended she had not. She was aware of it at the dinner table and in the kitchen garden in the long, mild afternoons, and in the conversations with Grant that now occupied the evenings in a way nothing had before. Conversations that ranged from the practical to the philosophical, and occasionally, when the children were in bed and the house was quiet, arrived in places neither of them had expected. He was a man who thought carefully about things and rarely spoke impulsively, and she was a woman who formed opinions quickly and liked to examine them out loud, and they were beautifully, unexpectedly complimentary in a way that delighted both of them. He read what she suggested. She listened to his assessments of the land and the livestock, and the weather with a seriousness that pleased him. She made him laugh more than he had laughed in years, and he made her feel, for the first time in her life, that the things she thought and the things she noticed, and the things she cared about had weight and value and consequence. He spoke of Ellen gradually, in the way that was healthy rather than the way that had been shutting everything down. He told Charlotte stories. Good ones, funny ones. The kind that showed her the woman his children had lost and helped her understand why the absence was the shape it was. Charlotte received these stories with gratitude and without jealousy, because there was nothing to be jealous of. Ellen was gone and Grant was here, and what he felt for Charlotte was not a replacement of something old but the growth of something entirely new, which was different in kind as well as degree. Rosie stopped waking in the night. This took until November, but when the nighttime crying stopped, it stopped completely, with the definitiveness of a child who had decided that the people she loved were not going to disappear in the dark. In late October, Grant sat down with all three children after dinner and told them the full story of Roy Dalton, simplified for age but truthful, the land dispute, the water rights, the man in Nevada who had believed a legal loss justified malice, and what the marshal had told Grant in July. He told them about the well. He was careful with the language, but he did not hide the gravity of it. He told them that the marshals had the man in custody and that he would not be coming back. He told them that their mother had deserved better, and that not being able to prove what he believed had happened was one of the hardest things he had ever lived with. Caleb sat very still through all of this with the expression of a 12-year-old processing information that rearranged large parts of how he understood the world. Nate asked 4 questions in rapid succession, then fell quiet, which was unlike him. Rosie climbed into her father's lap and put her head against his chest, and he held her and kept talking quietly, until they had all said and heard everything that needed to be said. Charlotte was at the table for this conversation, and afterward, when the children had gone to bed, she and Grant sat together in the parlor and she said, "That was the right thing to do." "It was overdue," he said. "Yes," she agreed, "but right." He looked at her with tired eyes and a quieter face than usual. "I don't know how I did this alone for as long as I did." She took his hand. "You did not do it alone. You had Caleb and Nate and Rosie. They needed me. That is different from having someone." "Yes," she said softly, "it is." The winter came, and with it the particular intimacy of a Texas ranch house in the cold months, the fire in the main room burning all day, the kitchen warmth extending into the parlor, the children spending more time indoors. Charlotte expanded the lessons and discovered that confinement intensified Caleb's intellectual appetite in a way the milder months had not, that given enough time at the parlor table with sufficient challenge, he could produce analysis of historical events and mathematical proofs that were genuinely impressive. She wrote to her sister Helen in Abilene. Helen wrote back with the particular combination of happiness and disbelief that a woman feels when her younger sister's situation exceeds all reasonable expectation, and expressed her intention to visit in the spring. Grant received a letter in December from an attorney in Austin regarding the disposition of the Dalton case. Roy Dalton would be tried in Nevada for the fraud charges and 2 additional counts related to activities in other territories. The letter was formal and precise and contained no warm comfort. Grant read it twice and set it on his desk and went out to the barn. He came back an hour later and found Charlotte had kept dinner warm and had not mentioned his absence or the letter, and he sat down and ate and looked at her from across the table with those steady brown eyes and said, with the sparseness of a man who does not say things he does not mean, "Thank you." "For what?" she asked. "For being sensible about things," he said. "It is my finest quality," she agreed, and he nearly smiled and passed her the bread. The new year of 1883 arrived on a clear, cold night, and Grant and Charlotte stood on the porch at midnight and watched the stars, which were doing their usual extravagant best, and he put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into the warm solidity of him, and they were both quiet for a long time with the vast Texas dark around them. "I used to dread the new year," he said. "Another year without her. Another year of managing things instead of living them." "And now?" Charlotte asked. He turned and looked at her, the starlight doing quiet things to his face. "Now I am not dreading anything," he said. He kissed the top of her head, for the first time in a very long time. She turned and put her arms around him, and he held her out there in the January cold, and she thought about the folded note and the traveling bag, and the woman she had been preparing to become when she left before anyone woke up. The woman who was going to be sensible and professional and not get her heart involved in someone else's life beyond the terms of the arrangement. And she was grateful, profoundly and specifically grateful, that a 6-year-old had stayed up to watch her pack. Spring came. Helen Sawyer arrived in April, which was exactly 1 year after Charlotte had stepped off the stage at the Hatcher Creek Depot, and she was a tall woman with Charlotte's same directness and considerably more volume, who immediately charmed all 3 children and assessed Grant Boone from under her hat brim with the comprehensive attention of an older sister, satisfying herself that her younger sister had not made a catastrophic error, and then released the breath she had apparently been holding since receiving Charlotte's wedding letter and said, to Grant directly, "You are exactly who I hoped you would be." Grant, who was not accustomed to being addressed in quite this way, said, "I hope to justify the assessment." "See that you do," said Helen, and went inside to admire the kitchen garden. Helen's visit lasted 2 weeks and was, by any measure, a success. She and Charlotte fell back into the ease of sisters who have been close and then separated, filling in the months with conversation that ran from morning to midnight. She told Charlotte things about their childhood that Charlotte had forgotten. Charlotte told Helen things about the past year that she had been keeping wrapped up in herself, and the telling made them more real and more permanent in a way that was satisfying. Helen left on a Thursday in late April from the same stage depot where Charlotte had arrived a year before, and hugged Charlotte so hard and long that Grant, who had come into town with them, looked tactfully at the mountains in the distance. Before she got on the stage, Helen put both hands on Charlotte's face the way their father used to and looked at her seriously. "You are happy," she said, not a question. "Completely," Charlotte said. Helen nodded. "Good," she said. "That is what I came to see." In May, Charlotte told Grant she was expecting a baby. She told him in the kitchen, which had become the room where important things in the Boone household were told, as if it had some special gravity that made truth-telling easier. She was direct about it because she was direct about everything, and she watched his face as the information arrived and rearranged itself into meaning. He stood very still for a moment. Then he crossed the kitchen and took her face in his hands, those large, careful hands, and looked at her with an expression that was so undefended and so full she felt it like light. "Are you well?" he asked. "Are you feeling well?" "I am fine," she said, and meant it. "Tired in the mornings, otherwise entirely fine." He kissed her forehead and then her mouth and held her against him for a long time without speaking, and she could feel the particular quality of his quiet, which was not the closed quiet of earlier months, but the open quiet of a man allowing himself to feel something fully without immediately trying to manage it. When he told the children that evening, Nate's reaction was characteristic. Immediate, loud, and operatic. He had opinions about names. He had opinions about whether it would be a boy or a girl, on which subject he expressed strong preferences in both directions simultaneously, which was a grammatical achievement. Caleb said, with the measured dignity of a 13-year-old, "That is good news," and Grant looked at him for a moment with an expression of enormous affection and said, "Yes, son, it is," and Caleb's composure held for approximately 4 seconds before he ducked his head and grinned. Rosie, seated in her customary chair beside Charlotte, looked up from her plate and said very seriously, "The baby will need someone to show them where everything is." "I can think of no one better for the job," Charlotte said. Rosie nodded with the gravity of someone accepting an important commission and returned to her dinner. The pregnancy was calm and straightforward, in the way that occasionally, graciously, pregnancies are. The late summer was hot, but Charlotte was stronger than she looked, which anyone who had known her for more than a week could have confirmed. And she continued the lessons and the garden and the household through August and into September with all her usual thoroughness, adjusting as needed, accepting help from Grant with the particular graciousness of someone who had spent enough years being independent to understand that accepting help from someone who loves you is not weakness, but a form of trust. Grant was attentive in ways that were practical and specific, which was his nature. He took over the heavier kitchen tasks without announcement. He reorganized the wood supply so it was closer to the house and easier to carry. He came home from the range at midday, which he had not done before, and these midday appearances, which he explained as necessary inspections of various ranch matters, fooled no one and were received with corresponding warmth. He was also, in the manner of a man who has lost one person he loved, and is therefore acutely conscious of the fragility of the people he loves now, occasionally possessed by anxiety that he managed with varying degrees of success. Charlotte understood this about him and did not interpret it as lack of confidence in her, but as evidence of how much he had at stake. And on the nights when she could feel the tension in him, she would talk to him about small, specific, ordinary things, the progress of the beans, the amusing incident with Nate and the schoolroom map, Caleb's request to start learning to work the cattle on weekends, until the tension in his shoulders released and he came back to the present tense, which was safe and solid and inhabited by both of them. October arrived. The baby arrived on a Thursday evening in the second week, after a labor that was attended by the doctor from town and Mrs. Hargrove, who had assisted at enough ranch births to be practically as useful as the doctor. Grant remained nearby in the most immediate way the proprieties and the doctor's professional opinion allowed, and he was the first person outside the room to hear the baby cry. The cry was loud and emphatic, the cry of a new person making a definitive statement about their presence in the world. The baby was a boy. Grant was brought in and sat beside Charlotte and looked at his son, small and red-faced and already in some way entirely himself, and the expression on Grant's face was the one Charlotte had come to love most, the unarmored one, the one that came out when he stopped trying to be composed and simply was. "He is," Grant said and stopped. "He is," Charlotte agreed. They named him James for Grant's father. James Elias Boone was introduced to his siblings the following morning. Nate declared him the greatest thing he had ever seen, then revised this to the second greatest behind the time he had seen a real stagecoach robbery foiled by the shotgun guard, then caught his father's expression and immediately reinstated James to first position. Caleb held his brother with the careful gravity of a 13-year-old who takes all responsibilities seriously, and looked down at the small face and became visibly and unreservedly moved by it, which he would never have admitted but which was witnessed by 3 people, and therefore permanent. Rosie stood beside Charlotte's bed and was shown the baby and reached out one careful finger and touched his cheek and said, "Hello, James," with a solemnity that made Charlotte's throat tighten. "You can hold him," Charlotte said. Rosie sat down carefully in the chair and held James with the concentration of someone performing an extremely important task, and the baby looked up at her with the unfocused, ancient attention of newborns, and Rosie looked down at him with those old, dark eyes, and something passed between the youngest of the Boone children and the newest that was entirely their own. Winter settled over the ranch, and the house was fuller and louder than it had ever been, and the fullness was not chaos but warmth, the particular warmth of a household that has found its proper population. Grant, in December, built a cradle. He built it in the barn over the course of several evenings after the children were in bed, from the same dark wood as the rest of the house furniture, and he carried it in and set it beside Charlotte's side of the bed without ceremony. Just set it there and looked at her. And she ran her hand along the smooth wood and felt, in her throat and her chest and her hands, the magnitude of being loved carefully by someone who had learned to build things well. The new year of 1884 came. James was 3 months old and had strong opinions about the hours between midnight and 4 in the morning, which he communicated without restraint. Charlotte and Grant took the night shifts in alternation, which Grant had insisted on from the beginning, and there was a particular intimacy to those dark, quiet feeding hours, the ranch asleep around them, the baby in his cradle or in arms, the two of them together in the narrow space between sleeping and waking. "I thought about what you said once," Grant told her one night, the baby drifting back towards sleep in his arms, "about not being afraid of the past, about understanding instead of fearing it." "I said that." Charlotte was tired and warm and not entirely certain she had said it as neatly as he was suggesting. "You did. When you told me you knew about Roy Dalton and you were not frightened away." He looked down at James. "I have been thinking about it for more than a year, what it is to have someone who knows the worst things and stays." "Staying seemed the obvious choice," she said. "By that point." He looked at her across the sleeping baby, those eyes that she now knew as well as her own. "It was not obvious to me that it would be your choice. I was not easy to choose." "You were never not easy to choose," she said. "You were only difficult to admit I had chosen." He was quiet for a moment. "I love you," he said. He said it plainly and directly, the way he said things that were true and important without embellishment or preamble. He had said it before, was not a man who said things he didn't mean or withheld things he did, but it landed fresh each time, specific and solid, the way real things are. "I love you," she said back, and meant it with everything she had. James made a small sound and resettled himself in his father's arms, and the night was quiet around them. Spring came again, the second spring. Caleb was 14 now, and working the cattle on weekends with the skill and seriousness he brought to everything. And Grant had begun teaching him the larger management of the ranch, the accounts, and the land assessments, and the seasonal decisions, preparing him with the long, patient thoroughness of a man who understood that this land and this work would be Caleb's inheritance. Nate had decided he wanted to become an engineer. He had arrived at this conclusion through a combination of Charlotte's history lessons, which had touched on the railroad expansion, and the arrival of a catalog from a Philadelphia technical college that had somehow found its way to the Hatcher Creek postal office, and which Nate had read with such complete absorption that Charlotte had found him asleep at the kitchen table with it open across his face. She wrote to the college for more information and added engineering texts to the list of things she sent away for, and Nate devoted himself to these with an intensity that was unprecedented in his scholastic history. Rosie, at 7, was reading at a level that continued to astonish Charlotte. She had moved through every suitable book on the shelves, and Charlotte had written to a bookseller in San Antonio for new titles. Rosie had opinions about all of them, expressed in the measured analytical language of someone who had always been more adult than her years suggested. And Charlotte was quietly and with great care beginning to think about what kind of future this child might be building toward, in a world where the options available to her were fewer than her abilities deserved, and more than her grandmother's generation had had access to, and where Charlotte intended to make every legitimate argument for every possible door. She talked to Grant about this one evening in May, sitting on the porch with the warm spring dark around them. "She is exceptional," Charlotte said, "genuinely exceptional. I want her to have teachers who know what to do with that." "There is a women's academy in San Antonio," Grant said. He said it in the way that indicated he had already thought about this and had already looked into it. "In a few years, when she is old enough, if she wants it." Charlotte looked at him. "You have already been looking." "I wrote in February," he confirmed. She felt the love she had for this man shift slightly in shape, the way things that are already large occasionally reveal themselves to be even larger. "Grant, she is my daughter," he said simply. If there is something she can become that she wants to become, it is my responsibility to clear the road." Charlotte reached over and took his hand, and they sat in the warm evening with the land spreading away from them in every direction, vast and quiet and theirs. The letter from Nevada came in the autumn of 1884. Roy Dalton had been tried, convicted, and sentenced on multiple fraud counts. He would serve his term in the federal penitentiary. The letter was official and final and closed the last open question of the legal matter, though the unprovable suspicion about Ellen would remain unprovable, which was the nature of some things. Grant read the letter and sat quietly for a time in his study. Charlotte left him to it. An hour later he came and found her in the kitchen garden, which was in its autumn reduction, the summer's harvest done, the beds turning for winter. "It is settled," he said. She looked up from her kneeling. "Yes. I do not feel what I expected to feel," he said. He was thoughtful, examining this. "I expected satisfaction. Instead I feel," he searched for the word, "finished, as if something has been completed that I could not complete myself, and now it is done and I can let it be done." Charlotte stood and brushed the soil from her hands. She crossed the garden to him. She put her hands on his chest and looked up into his face. "That is called peace," she said. "It takes different forms for different people." He covered her hands with his. The lines around his eyes had softened in the year and a half since their marriage, the watchfulness still present but no longer carrying the same weight. He was a man who had come through something and arrived somewhere better, and the passage showed in him the way time and difficulty and eventually survival always show, not erasing what had been there before but adding something alongside it. "Charlotte," he said. "Yes. You came to this house 3 months before you were supposed to leave, and you were sitting in my kitchen with a note written by a 6-year-old, and you were crying, and you told me you had become too fond of the household." He looked at her steadily. "It was the most important thing anyone has ever said to me in this kitchen. More important than asking you whether we were out of coffee," she said. "Marginally," he confirmed, and the warmth in his face was everything she had ever wanted. She went up on her toes and kissed him in the kitchen garden in the October afternoon, among the spent plants and the turned earth and the beginning of the next season already waiting under the soil. James turned 1 in October and greeted his birthday with the fullness of a child who had been loved with uncomplicated completeness from the first moment of his existence. He was walking, dramatically and at speed, and had strong opinions about everything and no interior monologue whatsoever, which Nate said was just like him, which Caleb said was not a compliment, which Nate disputed at length. He took his first steps toward Rosie, which was appropriate and which nobody who knew Rosie found surprising. She had been his most dedicated custodian from his first week of life, and he returned the attachment with the uncomplicated directness of a 1-year-old who has identified his favorite person and sees no reason to pretend otherwise. Rosie accepted the role with the same gravity with which she accepted all responsibilities. The winter of 1884 was mild by the standards of West Texas, and the ranch moved through it with the rhythms that had become, over 2 years, deeply familiar. The lessons in the parlor, longer now for all 3 older children, with different materials for each, Charlotte rotating through them with the skill of a teacher who had learned what each mind needed and how to provide it. The evenings on the porch when the weather permitted. The quiet hours when the children slept and Grant read and Charlotte wrote letters or mended or read beside him, the fire filling the room with its particular warmth. She wrote to the Women's College in Ohio about their teacher training program, because she had been thinking, carefully and specifically, about whether there was something she could do that would outlast her own household, some formal contribution she could make to the question of what women in this part of the world had access to in terms of education. She discussed it with Grant, who listened with his full attention and then said that if she could find a way to do it from Hatcher Creek or with limited travel, it had his full support, and if she could not find a way to do it without extended absence, they would figure that out too. "You support it entirely," she said. "You are a magnificent teacher," he said. It would be selfish to keep that only for my household." She looked at him across the dinner table where they were sitting after the children were in bed. "You have become considerably easier to be married to than I anticipated," she told him. "I had good material to work with," he said. She threw a biscuit at him, and he caught it, because Grant Boone's reflexes were excellent, and he ate it with the straight face of a man who has won the exchange and knows it. In the spring of 1885, Charlotte Boone, née Sawyer, established a small informal school in Hatcher Creek, meeting 3 afternoons a week in the back room of the church that the preacher generously made available. The school was for children primarily, but word spread quickly that the schoolroom was open to adults who wanted to learn, and within the first month she had a woman of 43 who had never learned to read sitting beside a boy of 8 working through the same primer, both of them entirely serious about the business of it. The school was not large. It was not official, not funded, operating on donations of time and the small amounts Charlotte charged families who could afford it, subsidizing those who could not. It was the kind of institution that existed in hundreds of small Western towns in that era, begun by women who had the education and the will and the specific clear-sightedness to see what was needed, and provide it without waiting for anyone to give them permission. Grant drove her into town 3 afternoons a week and collected her at 5, and often sat outside in the wagon reading, which he considered an entirely reasonable use of an afternoon. When Nate asked why his father sat in a wagon in town for 2 hours on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays, Grant said he was keeping an eye on things, which was not inaccurate. Charlotte was aware that he was out there. She was aware of it the way she was aware of the solidity of the ground under her feet when she walked, something so present and reliable that it would have felt extraordinary only by its absence. In August of 1885, James said his first full sentence. It was, "Rosie, come see," which he directed at his sister from across the kitchen, pointing at something interesting he had discovered under the table, and Rosie came to see. And Charlotte, who was standing at the stove, turned and looked at her husband, who had heard it from the doorway, and they shared the particular look of parents who have witnessed a milestone that will not be unwitnessed, a look that said everything about the ordinary, extraordinary nature of this life they had built. By late 1885, Caleb was 15 and working the ranch with the seriousness of someone who had already decided what his future looked like, and was moving toward it with steady purpose. He was taller than Grant by a half-inch, which Grant acknowledged with a combination of pride and competitive annoyance that Caleb pretended not to notice. Their relationship had become one of equals in development, a father and son who were beginning to be capable of working as partners, which was the best possible thing, and both of them knew it. Nate had his engineering texts. He was building things constantly in the barn, small mechanical devices of questionable purpose, but genuine ingenuity, that the foreman tolerated with the patience of a man who understood that the next generation had its own ideas about how things should be done. Rosie was 8 and reading philosophy, which Charlotte had provided in the spirit of giving her the best available tools and trusting her to use them wisely, and which Rosie was engaging with the same methodical seriousness she applied to all things. James was building his vocabulary at a rate that suggested he intended to have words for everything, and had recently begun following Caleb around the ranch, with the worshipful attention that the youngest directs at the eldest when the eldest is doing something impressively physical and competent. And Charlotte and Grant Boone sat on the porch in the October evenings, James asleep inside, the older children doing their various things, the land lying quietly around them in the autumn dark, and they talked about everything and nothing, the way people do who have learned each other well and find the talking itself to be the thing. Not only the information exchanged, but the simple ongoing fact of the conversation, proof of presence, proof of choice. Proof of the daily decision that is at the heart of all lasting love. She was 3 months along with their second child. She had told him the week before, and his face had done the thing it did, the opening of it, the unguarded full feeling of it, and he had held her in the kitchen and said her name very quietly into her hair, and she had thought that this was what she had almost left behind. These children, this man, this kitchen, this land. She had nearly packed her bag and disappeared before sunrise and spent the rest of her life being sensible and professional and alone. And the thought of it was so remote and so impossible now that it seemed to belong to someone else entirely, some earlier version of herself who had not yet understood what was possible. "What do you want?" he asked one evening on the porch, his hand warm over hers. "Boy or girl? Healthy," she said, "and as easy-tempered as James." "James is not easy-tempered," he said. "James had 3 opinions about breakfast this morning, 2 of which conflicted." "He is 2 years old," she said. "All of his opinions are negotiating positions." "You have told him that," Grant said. "I have told him words," she said. "He is determining what they mean." He laughed softly in the evening dark, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and the stars were doing their usual thing overhead, and the cattle were quiet in the pasture, and inside the house Rosie was reading and Nate was drawing diagrams, and Caleb was going over the monthly accounts, because Grant had asked him to begin learning them, and James was asleep in the cradle that had been built with large, careful hands from the dark wood of this land. The baby came in April, the spring of 1886, 4 years after Charlotte Sawyer had stepped off a stage in a small Texas town with a traveling bag and a practical disposition, and no idea whatsoever that she was walking toward the life she was meant to have. It was a girl. They named her Ellen Rose, for the woman who had come before and the child who had asked her to stay, and the name was spoken in the family from the first day with the naturalness of something that had always belonged there. Rosie held her sister in the afternoon light coming through the window, sitting in the rocking chair that had appeared in the room sometime during the winter, another of Grant's unremarked acts of provision, and the expression on her face was so complete and so certain that Charlotte, watching from the bed, understood that whatever Rosie was going to become in this world, she was going to be formidable. Grant sat beside Charlotte with their newborn daughter named for his first wife and his youngest daughter, and he held Charlotte's hand and looked at the scene in the rocking chair, and Charlotte looked at him looking at it. "All right?" she asked softly. He turned and looked at her, those steady brown eyes full of something that had no single name. "More than all right," he said. "Everything I have." She squeezed his hand. He squeezed back. Outside the window, the April sky over West Texas was the particular blue that April produces in that part of the world, deep and clear and vast, the kind of sky that makes you feel the size of everything and the smallness of yourself within it, and, paradoxically, the absolute importance of the small and specific life you are living. The kind of sky Charlotte Sawyer had not known existed until she came to this place, and which she knew, with all the certainty of a woman who had been careful and sensible her whole life, and had finally allowed herself to be reckless with love, that she would spend the rest of her life beneath. Rosie stood in the doorway with baby Ellen in her arms, turning back to show her brothers. Nate came forward at speed and had to be told twice to slow down. Caleb followed at a more measured pace and looked at his newest sister with an expression that he had stopped trying to make indifferent. James, awakened from his nap by the commotion, appeared in the hall in his small shirt and bare feet, and regarded the proceedings with the benign confusion of a 2-year-old who has not yet been briefed on today's developments. Rosie crouched down to his level carefully, with Ellen still in her arms, and said to him seriously, "James, this is your sister. Her name is Ellen." James looked at the baby with grave attention. Then he reached out one small finger and touched the baby's hand, very gently, in the same gesture Rosie herself had made over his cradle 3 years ago. "Hello, Ellen," he said. Charlotte made a sound she did not try to suppress. Grant put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him and looked at these 5 children, 3 of whom had arrived before her, and 2 of whom had her blood, and all of whom had her heart, and she thought about a folded note left under a breakfast plate by a child who had been afraid of disappearing things, and understood that the note had not just asked her to stay in a house. It had asked her to stay in a life. It had asked her to choose something instead of running from it. It had asked her, in the plain language of a 6-year-old who had not yet learned to be indirect about what mattered, to be brave. She had been brave. She was so glad she had been brave. Outside Hatcher Creek, Texas went about its afternoon in the April of 1886. The dry goods store and the stage depot and the small Methodist church and the informal school in the back room and the streets that knew, by now, the sight of Charlotte Boone coming into town on Tuesdays and Thursdays and Fridays, and the sight of the wagon waiting for her, and the man in the wagon waiting for her, patient and constant, the way that men who have learned the value of a thing will wait for it without complaint. The ranch stretched across its acres with the cattle in the pasture and the kitchen garden in its spring beginning, and the children in the house and the cradle by the window, and the 2 rocking chairs on the porch that had appeared there sometime in the autumn of 1882 and had been occupied every evening since, and would be occupied for many more evenings to come, through the seasons and the years. Through the growing of children and the changing of the land and the slow rightful forgetting of the things that had hurt and the slow deepening of the things that held. Charlotte Sawyer had come west to survive. She had stayed because a child had asked her to. She had loved because she was not, in the end, a woman who could be in the same room as Grant Boone's honesty and his grief and his laughing and his careful hands and his enormous, quiet capacity for love, and choose not to love him back. She had built something in this place that was more than she had known how to want before she arrived. A family, a home, a life that was fully and specifically hers. And if she thought, sometimes, in the warm mornings when the house was waking around her and the coffee was on, and the children were beginning their various noises in the various rooms, and Grant came in from the porch with the early light behind him, and looked at her the way he always looked at her, open and certain and without reservation, if she thought sometimes about the woman who had almost left without saying goodbye, Charlotte was only grateful. Grateful for the note. Grateful for the courage of a 6-year-old who had understood, more clearly than the adult, what was at stake. "Please do not leave us," Rosie had written, with labored letters and a pencil held too tightly. Charlotte Boone had not left. She never would.